du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
Even before the attack on the Soviet Union, Hitler declared, "A partisan war works to our advantage, since it lets us wipe out anything that rises up against Greater Germany." In doing so, he effectively erased any distinction between fighting partisans and annihilating civilians. Thousands of villages were burned to the ground, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed by Nazi punitive units, among the most brutal of which was the SS Dirlewanger Brigade, an outfit cobbled together from deserters, criminals, convicts, traitors, and even serial killers. All of them found their place under the wing of their father, a monster among monsters, to whom the Führer assigned a task so horrific it made even hardened Nazis' hair stand on end. Under the command of Oskar Dirlewanger, this SS unit became one of the most barbaric formations of the Second World War, and arguably the craziest military force in all of history. The Dirlewanger men took part in some of the most brutal reprisals against the partisan movement in Belarus, including, though in a secondary role, the massacre at Katyn. Only relatively small forces were assigned to implement genocide in that republic, but Dirlewanger's Penal Brigade was extremely active in anti-partisan operations, which in reality were aimed at exterminating the local population. Even within the Wehrmacht and the SS, this unit managed to gain a reputation as a pack of deranged thugs. How did it come to this? The story of Nazi Germany's most infamous penal commander began in Lower Franconia. On the morning of September 26, 1895, in Würzburg, the prosperous sales agent August Dirlewanger and his wife, Pauline Herrlinger, welcomed their fourth child. The newborn boy was named Oskar Paul, according to the future SS Oberfuhrer's own later recollections. The household was peaceful and harmonious. His father was a modest, educated, calm man. The family had Swabian roots, and Oskar stood out for his strong Swabian accent. As a child, the future butcher displayed no serious behavioral issues. He was not unfamiliar with discipline. In 1900, the family moved to Stuttgart and 5 years later to a suburb called Esslingen. There, Oskar finished school, received his diploma, and was all set to enroll in a university, though he first decided to complete his military service. A year before World War I broke out, Dirlewanger joined the machine gun company of the 123rd King Karl Grenadier Regiment. He adapted quickly to army life and picked up the basics of soldiering with ease. In 1914, Oskar, by then a junior non-commissioned officer, headed to war. From the outset of the First World War, Dirlewanger's regiment was sucked into fierce combat, first in Belgium, then in France. Oskar fought bravely, always trying to stay at the tip of the spear. Even in the first year of battle, his uncanny ability to survive became evident. He was shot, struck by shrapnel, stabbed with a bayonet, and nearly cut down by a saber. Around that time, he first set foot on Russian soil. In 1918, during an intervention near Taganrog, he was wounded by the Reds. One of these injuries permanently damaged Dirlewanger's leg. Yet he survived and earned an officer's commission. He was assigned to command machine gun training courses, but insisted on being returned to the front as a machine gun platoon leader. When the German army disintegrated in 1918, Oskar Paul led a large contingent of troops home, managing to maintain order and discipline. By 1918, he was back in Germany as a model war hero, but the country was in turmoil. The struggle among the communists, the Weimar Republic government, and the Nazis had already claimed thousands of lives. Dirlewanger took part in these events as a member of the Freikorps, volunteer units, fighting against left-wing insurgent groups. During that time, he received yet another head wound. Over the course of Germany's internal chaos, Dirlewanger was definitively and irreversibly drawn to radical views. In the 1920s, he joined Hitler's fledgling NSDAP. After the Nazis took power, he switched to peacetime work as an official in the labor exchange. Yet Oskar managed to wreck his entire previous life in record time. Over the course of the 1920s, he became seriously addicted to alcohol, and before long, he got himself in a vile mess, 2 years in prison for pedophilia. Dirlewanger's disgrace may seem shocking, but many years of combat can twist anyone's mental health. In addition, in the 1930s, he found himself in an environment where violence was normalized. Prison completed his moral downfall. The former hero and role model, an outstanding soldier from the Great War, quietly evolved into a criminal, and soon after, into a genuine devil. By the 1930s, he was on course to become the dark legend of the next World War. In 1937, after leaving the camp, Dirlewanger went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and upon his return in 1940, he joined the SS and was tasked with forming a special unit composed of convicted poachers. This new formation was intended for anti-partisan operations. The Nazis had already seized Poland, where a partisan movement had sprung up, and there was every expectation that many more territories would soon be conquered and would need to be subdued. The new unit was organized at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and in the fall of 1940, the group, named after its commander Dirlewanger, shipped out to Poland. There, Dirlewanger's men initially provided perimeter guard duty and kept watch over a Jewish concentration camp, but soon found work more to their liking. Several different partisan groups were active in Poland, and Oskar Paul's detachment was sent to exterminate them. For poachers used to hunting in the woods, hunting humans presented little difficulty. Moreover, Dirlewanger himself had absolute authority among his subordinates. He was merciless toward them if they disobeyed orders. The penal troops were beaten with sticks, locked for days in cramped wooden crates, or even shot by firing squad. It was at this stage that the Dirlewanger men's trademark savagery emerged. They rarely took prisoners, killing not only actual fighters, but anyone who fell under the slightest suspicion. As for Jews, they did not consider them human at all. In the fall of 1941, the brigade participated in deporting Poles from the city of Izbica. In the process, the troops ruthlessly looted the locals and later sold their spoils on the black market. This sense of impunity fueled increasingly depraved behavior. Meanwhile, Dirlewanger's sexual perversions grew worse. Everywhere around him were defenseless Polish and Jewish girls whose fates concerned no one. Oskar Paul was even placed under an internal investigation, naturally not for sadistic orgies per se, but for relations with racially inferior women. He managed to dodge the looting allegations, and killing was treated as just part of everyday life. But racial defilement, that was another matter entirely. In January 1942, Dirlewanger's detachment was sent to Belarus, just to be safe. There, they really cut loose. The partisan war in the Soviet Union grew to staggering proportions. In terms of organization, outside support, and military capabilities, Soviet partisans arguably surpassed any other similar resistance movement in history. The main Soviet territories kept them supplied with weapons, food, and specialists, and the cruelty of the occupation drove more and more people to flee to the forests. By late 1941, the Germans already realized they were losing control. In Belarus, the terrain was especially suited to large-scale partisan warfare, and the occupation regime was especially brutal. On top of that, after the destruction of the Soviet Western Front in the summer of 1941, many Red Army soldiers and officers were left stranded in this region. These men had no intention of laying down their arms and carried on the fight in a new capacity. Some partisan units were even commanded by Soviet generals. Belarus became the stage for the most desperate partisan struggle of all. Here, the partisans wrote both their most heroic and most horrifying chapters. The Nazi penal unit led by Dirlewanger was based in Mogilev and soon proved to be one of the occupation administration's most prized assets. Their first mission to fight Soviet partisans took place in the Klitschev district. The local partisans had recently pulled off a striking success. Not only had they taken several villages, they'd also overrun the district center's garrison, hanged the mayor, and killed the police chief in battle. But their victory attracted unwanted attention, and the penal unit was dispatched to destroy them. The Dirlewanger men's results turned out rather modest. They burned a few villages to the ground and seized only a small number of weapons. Most of the partisans simply melted away into the forests. They took out their frustration on the civilian population. In the village of Susha, over 30 people were executed, and the village was completely burned. At this stage, Dirlewanger's detachment began to fill up with even more diverse elements. They started recruiting not just poachers, but common criminals and collaborationists. If the poachers at least had some value as specialists in woodland warfare, the newcomers were basically seen as disposable. On the other hand, the punitive squads had access to unlimited alcohol, and their behavior was constrained only by the need to follow orders without question. This kind of freedom drew plenty of volunteers. At any given time, the unit had between 150 and 800 men. Because their casualties were so high, their numbers fluctuated wildly. Before long, one village after another was set ablaze. The Germans had far too few troops to maintain tight control over all of Belarus, so they tried to compensate by sheer ruthlessness. Hoping to undermine the partisans' main source of support, they destroyed the local population. In the summer of 1942, Dirlewanger's men carried out a series of incredibly brutal operations. Katyn is merely the most famous burned village in the occupied territory. Unfortunately, it was neither the first nor the worst in terms of casualties or the thoroughness of its destruction. At least a handful of Katyn villagers survived. In many other places, not a single soul remained alive. To understand what all this had to do with any genuine fight against partisans, consider just one example. In the village of Borki in the summer of 1942, the Germans reported killing 2,027 people. They found only 7 submachine guns and 2 pistols in the entire village and its surroundings. According to Dirlewanger himself, there were hardly any men left in Borki. The population was so large that they couldn't murder everyone at once. They locked the people in 5 barns, then fired indiscriminately into each building through the doorways. When the exits were blocked by piles of corpses, the barns were sealed and set on fire. Some managed to escape, but outside, they were gunned down by waiting guards. Oskar Dirlewanger personally took part in shooting those who tried to flee the flames. The Sonderkommando rampaged through eastern Belarus, massacring anything in its path. Their actions had the exact opposite of the intended effect. Entire villages would flee to join the partisans rather than wait to be slaughtered. Some villages stood empty. Others were turned by more experienced partisans into strongholds that resisted these raids. It wouldn't be correct to say Dirlewanger's unit never fought at all. However, it's striking that the number of bandits they claimed to have killed never matched the number of weapons they reported capturing. Where their reports boasted hundreds, even thousands of supposed partisan dead, they typically found far fewer firearms, often just a handful. Still, on occasion, the penal troops managed to inflict severe losses on the partisans. For example, in midsummer 1942, another large-scale operation was launched outside Mogilev, again in the Klitschev area. The partisans were hampered by the fact that their 4,000 active fighters were responsible for protecting 25,000 civilians living in the partisan-controlled territory. The Nazis assembled a force roughly the size of a full-strength division, complete with artillery, tanks, combat engineers, and aircraft. By encircling the forests, they succeeded in wiping out a sizable contingent of partisans. Despite fierce resistance, 1,800 of the guerrillas were killed. Dirlewanger's detachment suffered continuous casualties during that same period. Over the spring of 1942 alone, 2/3 of its men were lost. Recruiting criminals, along with Russian, Ukrainian, and even Belarusian collaborators, became unavoidable. Incredibly, they even included a group of Roma, whom the Nazis generally targeted for extermination, in the unit at some point. In fact, anyone who'd ended up in a concentration camp for whatever reason could wind up in Dirlewanger's ranks. For instance, at one point, the unit absorbed a group of men previously interned for homosexuality. There was even a case where several German communists were forced into the detachment. The logic was that they wouldn't dare run away because the partisans would surely shoot them on sight as SS. That idea backfired. For of these communist SS, men did indeed desert, and the partisans gladly took them in. On another occasion, an attempt to add a few men from the Baltic states ended in total disaster. They couldn't get along with their Slavic comrades in the unit, who simply shot them once the officers were out of sight. All of this took a toll on the detachment's combat effectiveness. Only one company of actual poachers remained. The rest were rarely fit for real fighting. If any of them fell into the partisans' hands, there was no chance of mercy. Just as the same was true in reverse. Captured civilians were often driven ahead of the SS to check for mines. Sometimes entire crowds of people would be forced to march through potentially mined areas. In March 1943, Dirlewanger's men took part in the destruction of Katan. The 118th Police Battalion did most of the actual burning. The Dirlewanger Battalion only provided support. In Soviet history, Katan is remembered not as the largest, but as a quintessential example of such mass killings. To the Nazis, it was so routine they hardly noted it. They torched 2 more villages the following day. During major counter-partisan operations, several villages could be wiped out in a single day. In their eyes, Katan was hardly special. Just during Operation Kapus between Minsk and Vitebsk in the summer of 1943, lasting 31 days, the battalion burned down 39 villages. In 1944, the Red Army launched one of the largest offensives in world history. Operation Bagration, which liberated all of Belarus, ranks only a little behind Stalingrad or Kursk in fame. In the West, at least one historian has referred to it simply as Hitler's greatest defeat. In late June, the German Army Group Center collapsed entirely under a series of blows stretching from Vitebsk to Bobruisk. Positions the Germans had defended for months fell within hours. Entire corps were cut off from the main group. This total collapse meant that every possible reserve was thrown in to plug the gaping holes. That included Dirlewanger's penal troops. Various police and punitive units were collected into a single von Gottberg group, intended to support a counterattack by an armored division and a heavy tank battalion redeployed from another stretch of the front. Against regular Red Army forces, the punitive troops fared far worse than they did against unarmed civilians. Von Gottberg's group proved to be the weak link, allowing Soviet forces to break through near Borisov into the German rear. Von Gottberg insisted that saving his own men was more important than aiding the tank crews, and he delayed the heavy Tiger Battalion's retreat across the Berezina River for hours. In a sense, he wasn't entirely wrong. Taken prisoner, the tankers could expect several years of forced labor in places where they'd earned their glory. For the punitive SS, however, there was nothing ahead but a noose. Afterward, Dirlewanger's unit, by then officially expanded into a regiment, was thrown into holding actions near Grodno. On August 1, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising erupted against German occupation. The Red Army was on Warsaw's doorstep, so the Polish Home Army Command believed help would soon arrive. But mere hours before the uprising, the Soviet forces east of the Vistula suffered a powerful German counterstrike, taking any immediate assistance for the Polish capital off the table. Meanwhile, the German leadership debated which forces to send in to crush the rebellion. The decisive voice belonged to SS Gruppenführer von Dembach, who oversaw anti-partisan operations in Eastern Europe. He convinced the top Nazi leadership that the SS must handle the job. Dirlewanger would play a key role. By then, his punitive regiment had been reclassified as a regiment in name only. It counted just 881 men, roughly the size of a reinforced battalion. They were ordered to spare neither themselves nor the Poles. The directive left no room for interpretation. Captured combatants were to be killed outright, whether or not they fought according to the Hague Convention. Women and children not actively participating in battle were likewise to be exterminated. The city was to be wiped off the map. The Dirlewanger men entered the fray on August 5th, attacking from the western approach into Warsaw. Their first target was the residential Wala district. Though the Poles were short on weapons, they fought with ferocious determination. One Wehrmacht soldier assigned to bolster Dirlewanger's group described it like this: "We entered Warsaw. The Poles fired on us, but we couldn't see them. We took one building after another by storm and found bodies of civilians everywhere, each with a bullet hole in the forehead. The next day, we got orders to take control of a road, forcing our way there through gardens. Our lieutenant kept pushing us forward. Suddenly, we came under heavy fire from a building. We blew the doors with grenades and rushed inside. The Poles swarmed us, leading to a short knife fight, and we pulled back, hiding in the shrubbery. 4 men who had traveled in the same railroad car with me were killed. We remained under constant fire. Then the SS arrived. They looked strange, no insignia on their uniforms, and they were all drunk. They immediately charged, screaming hurrah. Dozens of them were cut down by enemy fire. Next, a tank rolled up. We advanced behind it, with the SS at our rear. A few yards from the building, the tank was knocked out. It exploded, and we saw its cap thrown into the air. Another tank held back. So there we were, on the front line, while behind us, the SS were driving civilians out of their homes, forcing them toward the tank. making them climb onto the armor. I'd never seen anything like it. They forced a Polish woman in a long coat, carrying a little girl, to climb up. People already on the tank helped her up. Someone took the child, and at that moment, the tank lurched forward. The girl fell under the tracks. She was crushed. The mother screamed, and an SS man shot her in the head. The tank moved on. Anyone who tried to run was shot by the SS. Dirlewanger's men eventually pushed the Poles out of Walla. But what happened next was extraordinary even by the standards of World War II. Dirlewanger oversaw massacres inside the captured hospitals. Nurses were raped, then murdered, just like the patients. Then the soldiers herded residents into the yard of a nearby factory and executed them in groups. Walla was densely populated, so there were plenty of people to kill. After the clear out, they torched the buildings with flamethrowers, incinerating everyone unlucky enough to be hiding inside. It wasn't just Dirlewanger's unit involved in the slaughter, but they were responsible for nearly half the overall deaths. Some estimates say up to 40,000 people died in Walla. Even German soldiers, far from squeamish themselves, were horrified. In one hospital, they discovered wounded German POWs who had been captured at the uprising's outset. These experienced soldiers, no strangers to brutality, screamed in shock when they witnessed what was happening to Polish patients and medical staff. Dirlewanger personally hanged some of the nurses. Leaving the smoking ruins of Walla, the punitive troops advanced east. Their task was to clear out the old town and carve a corridor to German forces trapped there. They were reinforced with flamethrowers, armored vehicles, and artillery. Still, the fighting was so intense that it took a long time to break through. During these battles, Dirlewanger's men used women and children, seized from nearby neighborhoods, as human shields. Dirlewanger himself was right at the front, personally driving his men forward. It was the Dirlewanger unit that ultimately fought against the Polish army troops who managed to cross the Vistula in September. The Warsaw Uprising is often viewed as Dirlewanger's finest hour, if such a phrase can even be used in this context. What's telling is that the SS as a whole did not demonstrate any remarkable combat prowess, only an astonishing capacity for cruelty. Fighting against the Poles dragged on for 2 months, even though the Nazis had overwhelming firepower, including aircraft and artillery of every caliber. During those 2 months, the Dirlewanger regiment suffered so many casualties that it essentially had to replenish its ranks 3 full times, starting with 881 men and receiving 2,500 replacements. It was down to just 600 by the end of the battle. Warsaw marked the high point of Dirlewanger and his gang's reign of terror. His regiment was expanded into a brigade and then a division. But the death knell was tolling, not just for Dirlewanger's unit, but for the entire Reich. Yet the strategic breakthroughs on the various fronts didn't necessarily guarantee the Nazi state a swift end. On August 28th, while the Warsaw Uprising was raging, a revolt began in Slovakia. The Slovaks proved far more effective than their Polish counterparts, managing to capture several cities, including the sizable Banska Bystrica, along with airfields and stocks of weapons. Those runways allowed them to set up an airlift with the Red Army, evacuate their wounded, bring in supplies, and even field a Czech-Slovak fighter squadron. The Germans dispatched an assortment of Wehrmacht and SS units to crush them, Dirlewanger's brigade among them. The campaign in Slovakia brought the punitive unit no glory. Oskar Paul fully realized what was happening on the front lines. His drinking worsened. He spent night after night on a bender, and the SS advanced slowly and suffered huge casualties. Though they eventually broke the back of the uprising, numerous partisan detachments and many civilians escaped to Soviet-controlled areas. The brigade behaved as it always did until Himmler personally stepped in to restore some semblance of discipline. Through beatings and executions, Dirlewanger imposed order once more. Soon, his brigade was elevated to become the 36th SS Division. To achieve that, the penal troops were mixed with regular army units, and the old companies and battalions were filled out with punished Wehrmacht soldiers and concentration camp inmates, including political prisoners. About 100 cadets from officer training schools were sent in to establish at least a minimum of control over this rabble. In that form, the punitive troops were thrown onto the front, where they would fight their last battles. The Reich no longer had the manpower to keep anyone idling in the rear. But while the Dirlewanger men were marginally effective against poorly armed insurgents, they were no match for the well-equipped, battle-hardened Soviet forces. In December 1944, the unit was rushed to Hungary, where the Red Army's Budapest offensive was in full swing. Their very first encounter with Soviet troops triggered a mass desertion. Nearly 500 men ran for it, and the communists who had recently been added from the camps openly encouraged many more newcomers to surrender. By March 1945, one of Dirlewanger's old wounds flared up again. His division was defending a sector south of Berlin against Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. Konev's troops would soon put an end to the Dirlewanger detachment once and for all. On April 16th, the offensive on Berlin began. The German Ninth Army's lines were quickly shattered, and Soviet tanks surged toward the capital from the south, tearing through flaming woodlands. Konev's forces cut into the Ninth Army from both sides with 2 tank armies. Before long, about 150,000 German troops, including the 36th SS Division, were surrounded south of Berlin. The encircled force soon began surrendering in groups. But after all that had happened, SS men wearing double sig runes on their collars could hardly expect mercy. Most were simply led to the nearest crater and shot. On April 25th, when the remnants of the encircled troops made a last-ditch attempt to break out westward, only a few hundred remained. The Halby Pocket, as the battle came to be known, lasted only a few days. The trapped masses, including Dirlewanger's last Punisher squads, tried to escape near the tiny train station at Halby. There, they ran into point-blank artillery and ambushes. Soviet batteries rained shrapnel at close range. Any surviving tanks rumbled right over heaps of dead and wounded. Some Red Army gun crews burned through their entire ammunition stock, mowing down wave after wave of Germans with captured machine guns and the same Panzerfausts they had seized from earlier prisoners. Ultimately, perhaps 1/5 of those encircled managed to break free. The rest were killed or captured. Soviet infantry swept the forests, capturing or wiping out anyone still resisting. Only a handful of Dirlewanger men escaped with their lives. The 36th SS Division ceased to exist. Dirlewanger himself never witnessed any of this. In April, while what was left of his men were dying at Halby, he fled to Swabia dressed in civilian clothes. He was not yet 50, but his hard life had aged him prematurely. He looked like a somewhat pitiful old man, unlikely to attract notice. But Dirlewanger's face was too distinctive. By May, a former concentration camp prisoner recognized him. He was arrested and thrown into the Altshausen prison. Unfortunately for Dirlewanger, the guards there were Polish. He was beaten mercilessly over the next several days. According to one German officer held nearby, he could constantly hear blows landing and Dirlewanger's agonized screams from the corridor. The beatings went on until June 5th. That night, Dirlewanger was told to get up and walk out of his cell. He couldn't stand, so the Poles finished him off with their rifle butts and boots. His death certificate listed natural causes. Later, rumors popped up that Dirlewanger had been seen in Egypt, Indochina, or South America, but those were just tall tales. Trials for those involved in Dirlewanger's unit dragged on for years. Soldiers who left the detachment at some point, those who escaped from Halby, and those who had given orders to the unit all ended up in the dock. SS General Erich von Dembach became a key figure at the Nuremberg trials. He testified eagerly and thus managed to save his own neck, though he faced multiple prosecutions later on and eventually died in prison. The last known Dirlewanger men among local collaborators were executed in Minsk in the 1960s. A few others died or took their own lives during arrest attempts. According to the National Archives of the Republic of Belarus, 9,085 villages were destroyed during the occupation. Of those, Dirlewanger's men burned at least 179 to the ground. Estimates of this unit's civilian victims range from 30,000 to 120,000. In Warsaw alone, approximately 200,000 civilians lost their lives, with as many as 15,000 in Walla alone at the hands of Dirlewanger's troops.